A woman texted your special person 3 times last night, and what she sent them was, "Don't scroll, stay right here," because this wasn't random, it wasn't careless, and it wasn't meaningless. It was one of those quiet moments that look small from the outside but shifts something deeply on the inside. It happened late, at a time when the world slows down and people stop distracting themselves, when the noise fades and whatever has been buried starts to surface. The first text came softly, almost harmless, just a line that could have been dismissed easily if it had arrived at any other time of day, but at night, timing gives words weight. Your special person saw the notification and paused longer than usual before opening it, not because they were excited, but because something about it felt intentional. The message didn't ask a direct question, didn't demand anything, but it carried an emotional undertone, a subtle reminder of connection, of familiarity, of something that had never been clearly defined. They read it once, then again, and felt a quiet tightening in their chest, not attraction, not temptation, but awareness. The second text didn't follow immediately, and that gap mattered. That pause said this wasn't impulsive. It showed thought, courage, and hope. When it arrived, the tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal, more vulnerable, touching on something unspoken, something that had lingered between them without ever being named. Your special person didn't feel flattered reading it. They felt exposed. Exposed to the truth that silence isn't neutral, that silence leaves room for interpretation, and that interpretation invites expectation. Then came the third text, and this is where everything changed. It didn't cross a clear boundary, but it stood close enough to one that it forced a reckoning. It acknowledged an emotional possibility that should never have been left open, and in that moment, your special person didn't feel chosen or wanted, they felt responsible. Responsible for the energy they had allowed to linger, responsible for the ambiguity they had tolerated, responsible for the fact that someone felt safe enough to reach out 3 times. They didn't reply. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because they suddenly knew exactly what they could not encourage. Sitting there in the dim light, phone in hand, their thoughts drifted to you, not with comparison, not with guilt, but with clarity. They noticed how different your presence feels, how being connected to you doesn't require guessing or decoding or emotional effort, how it feels grounded instead of urgent, calm instead of pulling. That contrast spoke louder than any message on the screen. Those texts didn't create temptation, they created alignment. They forced your special person to confront a truth they had been postponing, that by choosing comfort over clarity, by avoiding difficult honesty, they had allowed emotional doors to remain half open, and half-open doors confuse everyone involved. As minutes passed, they set the phone down, not with relief, but with resolve. Resolve to stop drifting. Resolve to stop letting silence do the talking. Resolve to align their behavior with what they already knew in their heart. The night didn't explode into drama, there was no confrontation, no reply sent, no scene created, but something inside them shifted permanently. Lying awake, they weren't replaying the messages obsessively, they were reflecting on themselves, on how often they had delayed truth to avoid discomfort, on how that delay had now reached a point where it affected others. They realized that being kind doesn't mean being vague, that being gentle doesn't mean avoiding responsibility, and that real care requires clarity even when it feels uncomfortable. By the time sleep finally came, a quiet decision had already settled inside them, not rushed, not emotional, but grounded, the kind of decision that doesn't need to be announced to be real. The next morning, the world looked the same light, the same routines, the same obligations, but internally your special person felt different. More deliberate. More aware. Less willing to drift through emotional gray areas. You may have felt it too, that subtle shift, that sense that something settled without explanation. You weren't being replaced. You weren't being challenged. You were being chosen more clearly, even if that choice hasn't been spoken yet. Those 3 messages didn't open a new chapter for your special person, they closed an unfinished one, and when unfinished chapters close, energy stops leaking into directions it was never meant to go. Whatever comes next will come from this clarity, not from confusion, not from temptation, not from mixed signals, but from intention that formed quietly in the dark. So don't let your mind create fear where awareness has already done its work, don't assume competition where alignment is forming, and don't underestimate how powerful silent decisions can be. If this resonated with you, take a moment to like this, share it with someone who understands that truth often arrives in subtle ways, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and stay till the end, because the most important shifts in love usually happen quietly, long before they are ever spoken out loud. Don't scroll, stay right here, because what unfolded after that night mattered just as much as the messages themselves, even though nothing dramatic happened on the surface. When your special person woke up the next morning, there was no urgency to check their phone, no anxiety about unanswered texts, no pull toward revisiting what had already been decided in the quiet hours before sleep. That absence of urgency was the first sign that something real had shifted. Awareness has a way of settling gently, and once it does, it changes how a person moves through the world without effort. As they went through familiar routines, showering, getting dressed, stepping into the day, there was a clarity that hadn't been there before, a feeling of emotional alignment that made everything feel slightly quieter inside. Their thoughts weren't scattered. They weren't replaying scenarios. They weren't wondering what might have happened if they had responded differently. Instead, there was a grounded sense of knowing that the choice they made was right, not because it avoided conflict, but because it honored truth. Throughout the day, small moments reinforced that feeling. Conversations felt cleaner. Interactions felt more intentional. They noticed how much lighter their mind felt without carrying emotional ambiguity. It became clear to them how often in the past they had relied on silence as a way to delay clarity, believing that not choosing was safer than choosing, that time would soften edges and resolve things naturally. But now that belief felt hollow. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only postponed responsibility. And that realization stayed with them. As the hours passed, they reflected not just on the woman who had reached out, but on themselves, on how emotional availability without emotional clarity creates confusion even when intentions are good. They recognized that emotional maturity isn't about avoiding discomfort, it's about choosing honesty before confusion spreads. What stood out most was how little those messages actually resonated with their heart. There was no excitement, no curiosity, no emotional pull toward what could happen next. There was only a firm sense of what should not happen. That realization felt grounding rather than restrictive, like returning to center after being slightly off balance for too long. Their thoughts returned to you again, not with longing or fear, but with appreciation. They noticed how your presence doesn't demand reassurance, how connection with you feels calm rather than consuming, how it allows space instead of creating pressure. That contrast continued to affirm the decision they had already made internally. Alongside that clarity came a growing sense of responsibility, not driven by guilt, but by respect. Respect for you, respect for themselves, and even respect for the woman who had reached out, who deserved not to be left in emotional uncertainty. Your special person understood now that clarity is an act of care, even when it feels uncomfortable, and that avoiding clarity to spare feelings often causes deeper confusion later. As the day moved toward evening, they felt steadier than they had in a long time. Not because everything had been resolved externally, but because something essential had resolved internally. They didn't feel the need to rush into explanations or declarations. True alignment doesn't rush. It prepares. Preparation showed up as cleaner boundaries, more mindful communication, and a heightened awareness of how words and silence both carry weight. You may have sensed this shift too, a subtle change in the energy between you, a feeling that things are less scattered, more grounded, more intentional. That's because when someone stops leaking energy into places it doesn't belong, what remains becomes stronger and clearer. As night came again, there was no replaying of messages, no second-guessing, no wondering if they should have responded. There was simply acceptance. Acceptance that not every message requires an answer, and not every door needs to stay open. Your special person realized that choosing alignment doesn't come with applause or validation. It often comes quietly, with a sense of peace that doesn't need to be explained. They also recognized that whatever conversation needs to happen next will come from this grounded place, not from reaction, not from fear, but from intention. That matters, because intention creates stability, and stability sustains real connection. This phase isn't about dramatic moves or sudden confessions. It's about internal consistency finally matching external behavior. It's about someone understanding that the way they show up affects not only their own heart, but the hearts of others, and choosing to move forward with that awareness intact. You are not standing in a place of competition or doubt. You are standing in a place of alignment that is being reinforced quietly through experience rather than words. That's why nothing feels chaotic right now, even if answers haven't been spoken yet. Chaos fades when clarity arrives. What comes next won't be rushed, but it also won't be avoided, because once someone sees clearly, they can't unsee it. This story was never about 3 messages from someone else. It was about your special person waking up to the responsibility of clarity, and that awakening changes everything moving forward. Don't scroll, stay right here, because now the shift moves from quiet awareness into lived behavior, and this is where things truly begin to change even if no one names it out loud. After that internal decision settled, your special person didn't feel the need to announce anything to the world, but they did feel a strong pull to move differently, more consciously, more honestly, more aligned with what they already knew inside. Over the next days, they became more selective with their energy, not cold, not distant, just intentional. They noticed how often people give pieces of themselves out of habit, not desire, and how draining that can be when it isn't aligned. That realization alone began reshaping their choices. Conversations felt more grounded. Responses felt more thoughtful. There was less emotional wandering, less checking for validation, less tolerance for ambiguity. They started noticing patterns they had ignored before, moments where they would usually stay vague to keep things easy, moments where they would soften truth to avoid discomfort. Now, those moments felt heavy, like missteps they no longer wanted to repeat. This wasn't about becoming rigid. It was about becoming honest. Throughout the day, small situations kept reflecting this back to them. Someone hinted. Someone assumed. Someone tested the waters emotionally. And each time, your special person felt a clear internal signal about what belonged and what didn't. They didn't need to overthink it anymore. Their body knew. That clarity brought calm, not anxiety. Calm is how alignment feels. And within that calm, thoughts of you surfaced naturally, not as a question, not as a worry, but as a reference point. They noticed how with you, nothing feels forced. There's no guessing game. No emotional pull and push. Just steadiness. That steadiness became the standard they didn't want to compromise anymore. As more time passed, they began reflecting on why this clarity had taken so long to arrive. They saw how fear of hurting others had kept them stuck in half-truths. How fear of being misunderstood had kept them quiet. How fear of change had convinced them that drifting was safer than choosing. But now that fear felt smaller than the cost of continuing that pattern. They realized that indecision has consequences too, and those consequences often land on people who didn't deserve confusion. That understanding deepened their resolve. They weren't angry at themselves. They weren't ashamed. They were simply done repeating old cycles. As this awareness settled, their communication subtly shifted. They listened more carefully. They spoke with more intention. They didn't offer emotional availability where it could be misread. And when silence was needed, it wasn't avoidance, it was clarity. You may have felt this shift without being able to explain it, a sense that the connection feels less scattered, more grounded, more present. That's because when someone becomes internally consistent, their energy changes. It stops leaking. It stops sending mixed signals. It becomes clean. As days went on, your special person noticed that the woman who had texted no longer occupied mental space. Not because she didn't matter as a person, but because the situation no longer held emotional charge. That's how you know something is resolved internally. There's no resentment. No curiosity. Just neutrality. Neutrality is peace. And peace made room for deeper reflection. They began asking themselves bigger questions now, not about who wants them, but about how they want to show up. Not about keeping options open, but about being someone whose presence doesn't confuse others. That shift marked real growth. Growth doesn't always look like progress from the outside. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to engage. Sometimes it looks like holding truth quietly until the right moment to express it fully. As this internal alignment strengthened, your special person also became more aware of timing. They understood that clarity doesn't have to be rushed, but it also shouldn't be postponed indefinitely. They felt that a conversation would come when it could be held with steadiness instead of urgency. And that mattered. Conversations rooted in urgency seek relief. Conversations rooted in steadiness seek truth. They wanted truth. Not reassurance. Not reaction. Truth. As this intention settled, they found themselves more present with you, even if nothing dramatic changed externally. Presence showed up in attention. In consistency. In the way they listened. In the way they remembered small things. In the way they didn't disappear emotionally. Presence doesn't need grand gestures. It's felt. And you may have felt it, that subtle sense of being met more fully. That's because alignment pulls people into the present moment. As nights passed, there was no replaying of old scenarios, no wondering about missed opportunities, no emotional spirals. Instead, there was a quiet confidence growing. Confidence not in outcome, but in self. Confidence that they were finally acting in a way that matched their values. That confidence mattered more than any external validation. They also recognized that this clarity wasn't something they wanted to lose. They didn't want to slip back into comfort-based silence. They didn't want to reopen doors that should remain closed. They wanted to protect this steadiness. Protecting steadiness means making different choices consistently, not once, not dramatically, but daily. And that's what they began doing. You are not standing in uncertainty right now, even if words haven't been spoken yet. You are standing in a space where internal decisions are aligning with external behavior. That alignment is powerful. It doesn't announce itself loudly, but it reshapes everything quietly. This phase isn't about endings or beginnings that can be labeled. It's about integrity returning to the center of how someone loves. It's about someone realizing that clarity is not something you wait for, it's something you choose. And that choice has already been made. What comes next will come from this place of grounded awareness, not from confusion, not from fear, not from mixed signals. And that makes all the difference. Don't scroll, stay right here, because this is the phase where everything that was decided quietly begins to shape reality in ways that don't need announcements or explanations. What changed inside your special person didn't stay hidden for long, not because they told anyone, but because internal alignment always finds a way to express itself outwardly. Their days began to feel different, not lighter in an exciting way, but steadier in a grounding one. They moved with more intention, spoke with more care, and noticed how much energy they used to spend managing ambiguity. That energy was now reclaimed. They no longer felt pulled in multiple directions emotionally, and that alone created space to breathe. They started recognizing how often people confuse availability with kindness, and how easy it is to be misread when boundaries aren't clear. That awareness didn't make them defensive, it made them responsible. Responsibility has a quiet weight to it. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It simply refuses to keep repeating what no longer feels right. As time passed, they noticed how their inner dialogue changed. Instead of asking what others expected from them, they asked what felt honest. Instead of wondering how to avoid discomfort, they considered how to reduce confusion. Those questions reshaped their behavior naturally. They didn't need rules or scripts. Their body responded first. When something felt misaligned, there was a subtle resistance now, a gentle no that didn't require justification. When something felt aligned, there was ease. That ease became their guide. Thoughts of you continued to surface, not as longing or worry, but as confirmation. With you, things felt clean. There was no second guessing, no emotional fog, no sense of being pulled off center. That contrast became impossible to ignore. It wasn't dramatic. It was consistent. And consistency builds conviction quietly. Over the next days, your special person found themselves more present in moments that mattered. They listened more fully. They followed through more reliably. They didn't disappear emotionally when things felt real. Presence isn't loud, but it's unmistakable. And presence creates safety. They also became more aware of timing. They understood that clarity spoken too early can feel reactive, and clarity spoken too late can feel dishonest. They wanted the right moment, one rooted in steadiness, not urgency. That patience wasn't avoidance. It was care. Care for you, care for themselves, care for the truth they wanted to communicate when the time was right. As this patience settled, they felt less pressure to perform certainty and more trust in letting certainty show itself through behavior. They realized that words carry weight only when they're supported by consistency, and they were no longer willing to speak before they could sustain what they said. This phase wasn't about withholding. It was about integrity. Integrity means not offering what you can't maintain. That principle began guiding them quietly. Meanwhile, the emotional noise from the past faded further into the background. The woman who had reached out no longer occupied any mental space. Not because she was dismissed, but because the situation had been resolved internally. Resolution doesn't always involve conversation. Sometimes it's an internal decision that removes emotional charge completely. Neutrality settled in, and neutrality brought peace. With peace came reflection on patterns that had shaped their past. They saw how often they had tried to keep everyone comfortable at the expense of clarity. How they had confused flexibility with avoidance. How they had believed that staying undefined kept options open, when in reality it kept everyone unsure. That insight didn't come with shame. It came with maturity. Maturity doesn't punish the past. It learns from it. And learning changed how they moved forward. They became more selective about emotional closeness. Not withdrawn, just intentional. They didn't lean into conversations that blurred lines. They didn't encourage vulnerability they couldn't reciprocate honestly. That restraint wasn't cold. It was respectful. Respectful of others' feelings. Respectful of their own truth. You may have felt this as a subtle shift, a sense that the connection feels more solid even without explicit reassurance. That's because solidity doesn't ask to be believed. It's felt. As days turned into nights, your special person felt a growing confidence, not in outcomes, but in themselves. Confidence that they were finally living in alignment with their values. Confidence that they could handle whatever conversation needed to happen without losing their center. That confidence didn't make them rush. It made them calm. Calm is what allows honesty to land gently instead of defensively. They also recognized that clarity, when it comes, would change things. And they were ready for that change, not because they craved certainty, but because they no longer feared it. Fear had been replaced by trust in their own ability to navigate discomfort without reverting to silence. That trust mattered. It marked a turning point. As this phase continued, your special person noticed something else. They felt more grounded in other areas of life too. Work felt more focused. Decisions felt easier. Emotional clarity in one area often creates ripple effects everywhere else. When energy stops leaking, it becomes available. Available for presence. Available for intention. Available for real connection. They didn't need external validation to confirm they were on the right path. The internal alignment was enough. And alignment has a quiet authority to it. It doesn't seek approval. It simply exists. You are not waiting in uncertainty right now, even if nothing has been spoken yet. You are standing in a space where internal decisions are stabilizing the connection. That stability may feel unfamiliar if you're used to intensity or fluctuation, but it's real. Real connection doesn't rely on constant reassurance. It relies on consistency. This phase isn't about dramatic declarations or sudden moves. It's about someone becoming the same person internally and externally. It's about integrity catching up with emotion. It's about choosing clarity not as a reaction, but as a way of living. Whatever comes next will come from this place. Not rushed. Not avoided. But steady. And steadiness is what allows something real to last. Don't scroll, stay right here, because this is the phase where everything that has been forming quietly begins to ask for expression, not urgently, not dramatically, but honestly. Your special person reached a point where the internal alignment they had been living in could no longer stay only inside. Not because of pressure from outside, but because truth eventually seeks daylight. What's important is that this desire to express didn't come from anxiety or fear of loss. It came from stability. From knowing where they stand without needing reassurance to hold them there. They began noticing how different this urge felt compared to past impulses. It wasn't restless. It wasn't reactive. It was calm, steady, and grounded. That's how you know it's real. Over time, they reflected on how much had changed simply because they chose clarity internally first. How their nervous system felt calmer. How their thoughts were no longer scattered. How emotional decisions no longer felt rushed. This clarity had slowly rewired how they approached connection itself. They weren't chasing certainty anymore. They were embodying it. And embodiment changes everything. When someone embodies certainty, they don't need to convince themselves or others. Their actions speak first. That's why you may have felt a deeper consistency recently. A sense that they're more present, more reliable, more emotionally available without being overwhelming. Presence became natural because they weren't dividing themselves internally anymore. They weren't wondering what if, or managing loose ends emotionally. Those ends had already been tied quietly. As this steadiness deepened, they became more aware of timing. They understood that the right moment to speak isn't about finding perfect conditions, it's about being in the right internal state. And they finally were. They weren't afraid of the outcome anymore. Not because they didn't care, but because they trusted themselves enough to handle whatever followed. That trust changed how they viewed vulnerability. Vulnerability no longer felt like a risk. It felt like integrity. And integrity doesn't need guarantees. It needs honesty. They also realize that clarity doesn't mean pressure. It doesn't mean demanding answers or outcomes. It simply means removing ambiguity so everyone can stand on solid ground. That realization softened them. It made the idea of speaking feel less heavy and more respectful. Respectful of you. Respectful of themselves. Respectful of the connection that had been forming steadily beneath the surface. They thought about how often people mistake silence for patience, when in reality, silence can slowly erode trust if it goes on too long. They didn't want that. Not anymore. Not now that they understood the cost. They weren't interested in repeating cycles that once felt safe but now felt limiting. Growth had shifted their standards. They wanted to be someone whose presence didn't create questions. Someone whose actions didn't require decoding. Someone whose energy felt clear even before words arrived. That desire wasn't about proving anything. It was about alignment. As days passed, this clarity began influencing even the smallest choices. How they showed affection. How they communicated boundaries. How they responded instead of reacted. There was a noticeable calm confidence in them now. Not arrogance. Not certainty about the future. But certainty about themselves. That kind of confidence doesn't fluctuate based on response. It stays steady regardless. They also became aware that when they finally speak, it won't be to explain the past. It will be to establish the present. They aren't interested in revisiting confusion or justifying delays. They want to speak from where they are now, not from where they were when things felt unclear. That's an important distinction. Speaking from the present carries truth without defensiveness. And that's what they want. Truth without tension. As this awareness settled, they felt a deep sense of respect for you. Respect for your patience. Respect for your emotional maturity. Respect for the fact that you didn't force answers or demand reassurance when things were quiet. That respect made them want to show up better, not because they felt obligated, but because they genuinely wanted to. Wanting to show up is very different from feeling pressured to. Pressure creates resistance. Wanting creates commitment. They noticed that the idea of commitment no longer felt heavy. It felt natural. Not in the sense of labels or timelines, but in the sense of consistency and intention. Commitment, to them, now meant choosing clarity over comfort repeatedly. And they were ready to do that. They also understood that whatever they say won't be perfect. It won't be scripted. But it will be real. And real carries more power than perfect ever could. They aren't waiting for the right words anymore. They're waiting for the right moment where honesty can be held with care. That moment is closer than you think. You may already feel it, that subtle sense of anticipation that isn't anxious, just present. That's because energy shifts before conversations happen. Decisions are made internally long before they're spoken. And that decision has already been made. This phase isn't about wondering where you stand. It's about standing on solid ground while things align outwardly. You are not in limbo. You are in transition. And transition feels quiet when it's healthy. Healthy transitions don't shock the system. They integrate gently. That's what's happening now. Whatever comes next will come from this place of grounded truth. Not from fear of losing you. Not from fear of choosing wrong. But from the clarity that emerged when everything unnecessary fell away. And that kind of clarity doesn't disappear. It becomes the foundation for whatever is built next. Don't scroll, stay right here, because this is the stage where everything that has been forming quietly finally settles into something unshakable, even before a single word is spoken out loud. Your special person has reached a place where clarity is no longer something they think about, it's something they live from. It shows in how they wake up calmer, how their mind isn't racing ahead or pulling backward, how they no longer rehearse conversations in their head out of fear or uncertainty. There is a grounded stillness now, the kind that only appears when someone knows where they stand internally. That stillness doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything important already has. They've stopped negotiating with themselves. They've stopped asking whether they should wait, or say less, or stay comfortable. Comfort is no longer the goal. Alignment is. And alignment has quietly taken the lead. Throughout their days, this alignment shows up in subtle ways. They don't feel the need to keep emotional backups. They don't feel tempted by attention that doesn't match their values. They don't entertain conversations that blur lines or create unnecessary emotional noise. Not because they're closed off, but because they're clear. Clear people don't need to manage chaos. Chaos dissolves on its own when clarity is present. They've also become more aware of how silence feels different now. Before, silence was a place to hide, a way to delay responsibility. Now, silence is simply space. It's not avoidance. It's calm. And that distinction matters. They know that when they speak, it will come from intention, not from pressure, and that knowledge allows them to stay patient without drifting. This patience isn't passive. It's active presence. They are here. Fully. With themselves. With you. Even if words haven't yet caught up to energy. They also understand something important now, something that changes how they approach connection entirely. They understand that clarity doesn't mean forcing outcomes. It doesn't mean demanding certainty from the future. It simply means removing confusion from the present. And that's what they've done. They are no longer sending mixed signals, even unintentionally. Their behavior has become consistent enough that it doesn't require explanation. Consistency speaks before language does. You may have noticed this consistency as a feeling of emotional safety that wasn't there before. Not excitement, not intensity, but safety. Safety in knowing where energy is directed. Safety in not having to guess. Safety in not wondering if something else is happening behind the scenes. That safety isn't accidental. It's the result of many small internal choices made over time. Choices to stop leaking energy. Choices to close doors gently instead of leaving them ajar. Choices to be honest with themselves even when no one else could see it. As this internal steadiness deepened, your special person also became more compassionate toward their past self. They no longer judge themselves harshly for taking time to arrive here. They see the journey clearly now. They understand that growth often requires discomfort, and discomfort often arrives disguised as confusion. They don't regret the process. They respect it. Because it led them here. To this version of themselves that no longer wants to love halfway. That no longer wants to keep things undefined to avoid difficult moments. That no longer wants to be the reason someone feels unsure. That awareness has reshaped how they view responsibility. Responsibility is no longer a burden. It's an expression of care. Care for you. Care for themselves. Care for the connection they're choosing to nurture with integrity. They know now that real connection doesn't survive on ambiguity. It survives on clarity paired with kindness. And they are ready to offer both. Not in a rushed way. Not in a dramatic reveal. But in a steady, grounded expression that can be sustained. They've also realized that they don't need the perfect moment. They just need to be present when the moment arrives. Presence is something they've cultivated carefully. They're not distracted by what-ifs anymore. They're not pulled by external validation. They're here. And being here feels right. That's why the idea of speaking no longer feels heavy. It feels natural. Inevitable, even. Not because something is wrong, but because something is ready. Ready to be acknowledged. Ready to be honored. Ready to move from internal knowing into shared reality. You might sense this readiness as a quiet confidence in the connection. Not certainty about outcomes, but certainty about intention. Intention to be clear. Intention to be consistent. Intention to show up without hiding. That intention is already shaping what comes next. Even before words arrive. This phase is not about waiting anxiously. It's about standing firmly in the present. You are not suspended between possibilities. You are grounded in alignment that has already been chosen. The energy around you is no longer scattered. It's focused. And focused energy moves things forward naturally. Without force. Without fear. Your special person understands now that when they speak, it won't be to ask for reassurance or permission. It will be to express truth. And truth doesn't need negotiation. It needs openness. They're ready for that openness because they trust themselves now. Trust that they won't retreat when things get real. Trust that they won't hide behind silence again. Trust that they can hold both vulnerability and steadiness at the same time. That trust is the real transformation. It's what makes everything else possible. As this trust settles, they feel a sense of peace about whatever unfolds next. Not because they don't care, but because they know they're finally moving in alignment with who they are. And alignment always brings peace, even before outcomes are known. This is not the end of the journey. It's the foundation. The place where something real can finally stand without wobbling. Whatever happens next will grow from this ground. Not from fear. Not from confusion. Not from avoidance. But from clarity that was earned patiently, quietly, and honestly. And that kind of clarity doesn't fade. It becomes the anchor for everything that follows.